The kick landed with a sickening thud. The German Shepherd yelped, and the teenager laughed, not the nervous laugh of a kid who'd made a mistake, but something colder. "What's wrong, lady? Your dog is so pathetic?" The veteran with trembling hands didn't respond, just stared at the ground like she'd learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. David Warren's son tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, that guy is so mean, bullying a dog. 7 years. 7 years of staying invisible. 7 years of teaching himself not to see what everyone else missed. 7 years of swearing he'd never profile another stranger again. But some instincts don't fade, they just hibernate." And as the words left David's mouth, "That's enough, kid." He didn't know he was pulling the thread on a conspiracy woven together 15 years ago, one that would force him to become exactly what he'd been running from. Sometimes standing up for what's right means stepping into something very, very wrong. Memorial Park on a Saturday afternoon was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The sun filtered through oak trees older than most of the people walking beneath them, casting dappled shadows across freshly mowed grass that smelled like summer and normalcy. Children's laughter drifted from the playground, where swings creaked in a rhythm David Warren had learned to find comforting. He and his son Tommy came here every weekend, rain or shine, because routines were important. Routines kept Tommy calm. Routines kept David from thinking too much about the life he'd left behind. Tommy was 9 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that never stayed combed, and eyes that saw things other people didn't. The doctors called it high-functioning autism. David called it a gift wrapped in challenges. Tommy didn't talk much to strangers, didn't like crowds, didn't understand why people said things they didn't mean, but he understood animals. And he understood when something was wrong. Right now, Tommy was watching a woman on a bench about 50 feet away, his small hand gripping David's with unusual intensity. The woman sat perfectly still, spine straight as a rifle barrel, one hand resting on the head of a German Shepherd that lay at her feet. She wore jeans and a faded army t-shirt, her gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had probably been regulation once. David's trained eye caught the details without meaning to. The way she scanned the park perimeter every 30 seconds, the slight tremor in her left hand, the service dog vest on the Shepherd, worn but clean, with patches that indicated PTSD support training. A veteran, probably in her early 50s, probably carrying more than anyone should have to carry. David forced himself to look away. Not your problem, he thought. Not anymore. 7 years ago, he'd been Special Agent David Warren, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, the guy they called when they needed someone to get inside a killer's head. He'd been good at it. Too good. Good enough that he'd helped catch 23 serial offenders in 12 years. Good enough that one of them had become obsessed with him. Good enough that his wife Rachel had paid the price when that obsession turned deadly. The official report said home invasion, wrong place, wrong time. But David knew better. He'd seen the crime scene. He'd read the signature. It had been a message meant for him, delivered in blood because that was the only language some monsters spoke. So he'd quit. Moved to a small town 2 states over, changed their names legally. Became David Warren, freelance IT consultant, single father, nobody special. Taught himself not to profile strangers on the street, not to catalog behavioral tics, not to see the darkness that sometimes lived behind people's eyes. Tommy had been 2 when Rachel died. He didn't remember her, didn't remember the before times when David had been someone else, and David had promised himself, promised Rachel's memory, that he'd keep his son safe. That meant staying invisible. That meant not getting involved. But then Tommy tugged his sleeve again and pointed toward the bench where the veteran sat. A teenager had appeared, maybe 16 or 17, wearing clothes that cost more than David's monthly rent. 2 friends flanked him, both trying to look tough and mostly succeeding at looking rich and bored. The lead kid bounced a soccer ball casually, his path taking him directly toward the bench. David's stomach tightened. He recognized that walk. Predatory, purposeful. The kid wasn't heading toward the bench. He was heading toward a target. The soccer ball rolled, seemingly by accident, and bumped against the German shepherd's side. The dog didn't react beyond lifting its head, well-trained and controlled. The veteran looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Sorry," the teenager said, his voice loud enough to carry across the grass. "Didn't see your mutt there. Maybe you should keep it on a shorter leash." He reached down as if to retrieve the ball, and his foot swung out in what might have looked like an accident if David hadn't been watching. If David hadn't seen the calculation in the boy's eyes, the way he checked over his shoulder first, the slight smile that said this was intentional, the kick landed with a sickening thud. The German shepherd yelped, scrambling to its feet. And the teenager laughed, not the nervous laugh of a kid who'd made a mistake, but something colder, something rehearsed. "What's wrong, lady? Your dog is so pathetic?" His friends joined in, their laughter sharp and cruel in the warm afternoon air. The veteran stood slowly, her hands shaking harder now, her face pale. People nearby noticed, looked, then looked away. The universal language of "not my problem." David felt Tommy's hand tighten around his. "Dad, that guy is so mean, bullying a dog." His son's voice was small but certain, the way it got when he didn't understand why the world allowed cruelty. David's chest constricted. He wanted to tell Tommy that sometimes you had to look away, that getting involved meant becoming visible, that visible meant vulnerable. But when he looked down at his son's face, he saw Rachel. She'd never looked away, never taught their son that safety mattered more than doing what was right. 7 years of hiding. 7 years of teaching himself not to see what everyone else missed. 7 years of swearing he'd never profile another stranger again. But some instincts don't fade, they just hibernate. David stood, his body moving before his brain could properly object, and walked toward the bench. As he moved, his mind catalogued details against his will. The teenager's expensive sneakers, barely scuffed. The designer watch, the kind you bought to show off, not to tell time. The way his friends kept glancing at a black SUV parked near the far entrance, windows tinted dark. The slight tremor in the lead kid's hands that didn't match his cocky smile. Fear. The boy was afraid of something, even as he projected aggression. David stopped about 10 feet away, his voice calm and level. "That's enough, kid." The teenager turned, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated contempt so quickly that David knew it was practiced. Someone had taught this boy how to perform cruelty. The question was why. "Or what?" the teenager said, taking a step closer. "You gonna hit a minor? Go ahead. My dad's got lawyers that'll own your house before dinner." His friends moved to flank him, but David could see their hearts weren't in it. They were following a script too, uncomfortable but committed. David didn't respond to the threat. Instead, he looked past the boy to the veteran. "Ma'am, are you and your dog okay?" The woman nodded stiffly, her jaw tight, one hand on the shepherd's head as if drawing strength from the contact. The dog was calm now, leaning against her leg, its dark eyes watching David with the kind of assessment that came from professional training. This wasn't just a pet. This was a working animal, probably the only thing keeping this woman tethered when the memories got too loud. "We're fine," she said, her voice rough with disuse or maybe just emotion. "We don't want any trouble." The last part sounded like something she'd said before, many times, a mantra against the world's casual violence. David recognized that tone. He'd heard it in interview rooms, in witness statements, in the voices of people who'd learned that fighting back often cost more than surrender. The teenager smirked. "See? She doesn't need a hero. Mind your own business." Old man. He couldn't have been more than 45, David thought with a flicker of dark humor. But to a 17-year-old, anyone over 30 probably qualified as ancient. The boy turned back to the veteran, emboldened by David's stillness. "You shouldn't bring a dog to a public park if it can't handle a little rough play. What if it attacked a kid? People like you, With your PTSD and your sob stories, you think the world owes you something. It doesn't. The words hit their target. David saw the veteran flinch, saw her shoulders curve inward like she was taking fire. The teenager saw it too, and his smile widened. He was enjoying this. But underneath the enjoyment, David caught something else. A glance toward the black SUV. A quick check, like he was making sure someone was watching, like he was performing for an audience. And that's when David knew. This wasn't random teenage cruelty. This was deliberate. This was a test or a message or both. The question was, for whom? Tommy appeared at David's elbow, having followed despite being told to stay by the water fountain. His son looked up at the teenager with an expression of pure confusion. Why would you hurt a dog? Dogs are nice. That's a working dog. You can tell by the vest. It helps her when she's scared. Why would you want to make her more scared? The simple honesty in Tommy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The teenager's smirk faltered. His friends shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, David saw past the performance. Saw a kid who was maybe not as comfortable with cruelty as he pretended to be. But then the boy's eyes flicked to the SUV again, and the mask snapped back into place. Whatever, kid. Tell your dad to pick his battles. This town's got a pecking order, and he just put himself on the wrong side of it. He turned to walk away, his friends following, but not before David caught the license plate on the black SUV as it started to pull out. The windows rolled down just enough for David to see someone in the passenger seat holding what looked like a phone. Recording, or just observing. The veteran was gathering her things with shaking hands, clearly wanting to leave before the situation escalated further. David approached slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. I'm David. This is my son Tommy. That kid was out of line. Are you sure you're both okay? Up close, he could see the deep lines around her eyes, the kind that came from pain more than age. Military bearing still showed in her posture, but it was fighting against something that wanted to curl her into a protective ball. Colonel Margaret Torres, she said automatically, then seemed to catch herself. Retired. Everyone calls me Maggie. And yes, we're fine. Rangers had worse. She reached down to stroke the dog's head, and the shepherd leaned into her touch. Thank you for stepping in, but you really shouldn't have. That was Robert Hastings' kid, Brandon. His father owns half the commercial real estate in this county. People who cross the Hastings family tend to regret it. The name landed in David's mind like a stone in still water, sending out ripples of recognition. Robert Hastings. He'd heard that name before, but where? David's memory was trained to catalog details, to file away information that might become relevant later. Somewhere in the past 7 years of deliberately not paying attention, he'd heard or read something about Robert Hastings. Something that had pinged his instincts even through his self-imposed retirement. Well, David said carefully, his kid needs to learn some manners. Money doesn't buy the right to be cruel. Maggie's laugh was bitter. You'd be surprised what money buys. Look, I appreciate what you did. I do. But I've been dealing with this for 3 months now. Ever since I testified at the city council meeting about veteran housing. Suddenly, everywhere I go, there's Brandon and his friends. Always just on the edge of legal. Always with witnesses who see nothing. It's harassment designed to make me look unstable, and it's working. David's instincts, dormant for 7 years, woke up fully. Pattern behavior, coordinated harassment, a target isolated and discredited. This wasn't teenage bullying. This was strategy. 3 months? He asked. Always Brandon? Always recorded? Maggie's eyes sharpened. How did you know about the recording? David gestured toward the departing SUV. The person in the passenger seat, phone out, aimed this way. They were documenting the encounter. Probably to edit it, Maggie said tiredly. Make it look like Ranger was aggressive, like I was unstable. It's what they've been doing. Building a case that I'm a danger to the community, that my PTSD makes me unreliable. Funny thing is, I've been managing just fine for 10 years since I retired. But now, When I speak up about how the city's cutting veteran services while approving tax breaks for Hastings developments, suddenly I'm a problem. She gathered Ranger's leash. I should go, and you should forget you saw any of this. Take care of your son. Stay out of it. She walked away before David could respond, her spine straight despite everything, Ranger matching her pace perfectly. David watched her go, his mind already working through the implications. Tommy tugged his hand. Dad, she's really sad. And that boy was scared. Did you see? His hands were shaking. Not mad shaking. Scared shaking. David looked down at his son, whose special way of seeing the world had just confirmed what David's training had already told him. Brandon wasn't a bully acting on his own impulses. He was being forced into a role. The question was why, and by whom. David told himself to let it go. Told himself that this wasn't his problem, that he'd done his good deed for the day, that getting curious about the Hastings family was exactly the kind of visibility he'd promised to avoid. But as he and Tommy walked back to their car, David's phone buzzed with an unknown number. The text message was simple. You should have minded your own business. Now you've made yourself interesting. Below it, a photo, Tommy at his school, taken that morning. Another photo, their house, taken from the street. And a final line, nice kid. Would be a shame if something happened to him. David's blood went cold. His hand tightened on Tommy's shoulder, maybe too tight, because his son looked up with concerned eyes. Dad? You okay? You look like you do when you have bad dreams. David managed a smile that felt like glass. I'm fine, buddy. Let's go home. But he wasn't fine. In trying to do one decent thing, he'd done exactly what he'd sworn never to do again. He'd become visible. And now someone was threatening his son. That night, after Tommy was asleep, David sat in his home office with his laptop and did what he'd promised himself he'd never do again. He investigated. 7 years of staying off the grid had left his FBI access revoked, but he still had friends in places that mattered, people who owed him favors. People who understood that sometimes you needed to look at sealed files. He started with Robert Hastings, billionaire philanthropist, and within an hour, he'd found the thread that had been nagging at his memory. 15 years ago, there had been an arms trafficking investigation. Weapons flowing to militia groups in the Middle East, traced back through a network of shell companies to a handful of U.S. defense contractors. The investigation had been shut down abruptly, evidence classified, key witnesses disappearing into protective custody, or simply disappearing. One name had appeared in the preliminary reports before the blackout, Robert Hastings, then a mid-level executive at a defense firm with suspiciously good connections. The case had gone nowhere. The lead FBI agent had been reassigned. The witnesses had recanted or vanished. All very neat, all very suspicious. David dug deeper, following threads through newspaper archives and military records that were technically public, but practically invisible. He found Maggie Torres's service record, 25 years in the Army, the last 10 in intelligence, multiple commendations, a Bronze Star, and then, 15 years ago, an incident in Afghanistan, an operation that had gone wrong, civilians killed, allegations of war crimes. Maggie had been investigated, cleared, but the shadow had followed her into retirement. The details were sparse, buried under redactions, but David found something interesting. Maggie had filed a report before that incident, flagging suspicious weapons shipments to local militia groups, suggesting U.S. contractor involvement. The report had been classified, the operation had gone ahead, the disaster had followed. And now, 15 years later, Maggie was being systematically harassed by the son of Robert Hastings. Coincidence? David didn't believe in coincidences. Not when patterns emerged. Not when the pieces fit together like a puzzle designed to look random. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time, a video file. David's finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won. He opened it. The video showed Maggie, earlier that day, but not the confrontation David had witnessed. This was different. Maggie in a grocery store, Ranger by her side, and Brandon accidentally knocking into her, causing her to drop her bags. The video was edited to make it look like Ranger had lunged at Brandon, like Maggie had lost control. It was subtle but effective. Show that video to a judge, and it would support a restraining order. Show enough videos like that, and you could make the case for involuntary commitment, or you could simply break someone down until they stopped being a problem. David closed his laptop and sat in the dark, thinking. He'd left the FBI because getting involved had cost him Rachel. He'd promised himself he'd protect Tommy above everything else, and that meant staying invisible, staying safe, staying out of other people's nightmares. But someone had just made Tommy a target. Someone had decided that David's single act of decency was worth threatening, and that someone had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed David Warren, IT consultant, was soft. They didn't know about Special Agent David Warren, the man who'd tracked down some of the worst predators in America by learning to think like them. 7 years of hiding. 7 years of pretending he wasn't what he was. But some instincts don't fade. They just wait for the right trigger. And threatening his son? That was the trigger. David picked up his phone and sent a text to an old colleague, a woman who'd left the bureau around the same time he had, for different but equally valid reasons. Need a favor? Background on Robert Hastings. Everything not in the public record. And I need to borrow some equipment. The response came within minutes. Thought you were retired, David typed back. So did I. The next morning, David dropped Tommy off at school with extra instructions for the principal about security, about not releasing his son to anyone without David personally present, about calling immediately if anything unusual happened. Then he drove to Memorial Park, where Maggie was sitting on the same bench, Ranger at her feet, like she was daring the universe to come at her again. David sat down at the other end of the bench, not too close, respecting space. Colonel Torres, we need to talk. Maggie didn't look at him. I told you to stay out of it. Her voice was flat, exhausted. David noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hand shook even while petting Ranger. Yeah, well, someone sent me pictures of my son with a threat attached. So I'm in it whether I want to be or not, and I think you and I are in it for the same reason. Robert Hastings. Afghanistan, 15 years ago. Arms trafficking investigation that got buried. That got her attention. Maggie turned to face him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Who are you really? David considered lying, considered keeping his cover, but something in Maggie's expression told him she'd see through it. Combat veterans had their own kind of truth detector. I used to be FBI. Behavioral analysis. Serial crimes. I quit 7 years ago for personal reasons. I've been trying very hard to stay retired, but Hastings made that impossible when he targeted my kid. FBI, Maggie repeated, and something like hope flickered in her eyes before dying out. Then you know how this works. People like Hastings, they're untouchable. Money, connections, lawyers. I tried to blow the whistle 15 years ago on what I saw in Afghanistan. Weapons shipments with serial numbers that didn't match manifests. Contractors selling to both sides. I filed reports. I testified to investigators. And you know what happened? The investigation disappeared. I got blamed for an operation that went sideways. Good soldiers died because someone gave our position to the enemy, and I've been carrying that guilt ever since. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. Hastings sold us out. He made millions, and my team paid in blood. David absorbed this, the pieces falling into place. And now you're speaking up again, about veteran services, about Hastings getting city contracts, and suddenly you're being harassed, discredited, made to look unstable. He's eliminating a threat the same way he did 15 years ago, except this time, he's using his son to do it. Maggie nodded slowly. Brandon, that kid's not evil. I've watched him these past months. He's terrified. Every time he comes after me, he checks his phone first, like he's getting instructions. And after, he looks sick. Whatever his father's making him do, he doesn't want to do it. Then we have leverage, David said. Maggie laughed bitterly. Leverage? Against Robert Hastings? He's got the police chief in his pocket, half the city council taking his campaign donations. I'm a retired vet with PTSD living on a pension. You're what did you say? Retired FBI? We've got nothing. David met her eyes. We've got the truth. And we've got the fact that Hastings doesn't know I'm not actually retired. He thinks he's dealing with a concerned citizen who'll back down when threatened. But I spent 12 years learning how to find people who didn't want to be found, how to build cases that stuck. And I'm very, very motivated right now. Why? Maggie asked. Why risk it? You've got a son to protect. Walk away. I'll handle this. David thought about Rachel, about the promise he'd made, about 7 years of hiding, and how it hadn't actually kept them safe. Because my wife died 7 years ago. A serial killer I helped catch became obsessed with me, and when he couldn't get to me, he went after her. I quit because I thought staying away from that world would keep my son safe. But today, I got a message that proved I was wrong. Hiding doesn't work. Not when the monsters decide to come for you anyway. So if I'm going to be in danger, I'd rather it be for doing something right than for doing nothing. Maggie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, what's your plan? David pulled out his phone, showing her surveillance photos his friend had sent over. Hastings has a pattern. Every business deal he makes, there are casualties. Competitors who suddenly face financial ruin, whistleblowers who get discredited. He's careful, uses cutouts, stays clean, but he's also arrogant. He's been doing this for 20 years, and he's never faced consequences. That makes people sloppy. We find the sloppiness. We build a case. We make enough noise that the FBI can't ignore it this time. And Brandon? Maggie asked. That kid's a victim too. David had been thinking about that. About the fear in Brandon's eyes, the way he kept checking for approval, or maybe just checking that someone was watching. We flip him. If he's being coerced, we offer him a way out. Protective custody, immunity, whatever it takes. But first, we need to understand what hold Hastings has over his own son. Maggie stood, Ranger immediately at her side. I've got something. Didn't think it mattered before, but maybe it does. Come on. She led David to her car, a beat-up sedan with military precision in its organization. From the glove box, she pulled out a flash drive. 3 months ago, right before this harassment started, I got this in the mail. No return address. Just this drive and a note that said, "You were right about Hastings. Stay quiet or this goes public." She handed it to David. It's videos, home security footage, of Brandon's mother 2 years ago. She supposedly killed herself, overdose. But these videos, they show something different. David's blood chilled. Show me. They drove to David's house, where his secure setup would let them review the footage safely. Tommy was still at school, the house empty and quiet. David loaded the flash drive with the kind of security protocols that would alert him if anyone tried to trace the access. The videos were time-stamped from 2 years earlier, and they showed the interior of what was clearly a high-end home. Expensive furniture, art on the walls, and a woman, maybe 40 years old, arguing with Robert Hastings. The audio was muffled, but David could make out enough. She was threatening to leave, to take Brandon, to go to the police about something. Hastings was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that David associated with psychopaths who'd planned everything out. The woman took pills from a prescription bottle, just her regular medication, by the look of it. She poured water, drank, and then, over the next 10 minutes, she started to deteriorate. Confusion, slurred speech, collapse. And through it all, Robert Hastings sat in a chair, watching, not helping, not calling 911, just watching his wife die. He switched her pills, Maggie said quietly. That's what I think. Replaced her medication with something else. Maybe an overdose of the same drug, or maybe something different. Made it look like suicide. And he made sure the security cameras caught it. David nodded, his mind racing. Insurance. He keeps this footage in case anyone ever questions her death. Shows her taking the pills herself. But what he doesn't show is the minutes before, the argument, the fact that he didn't call for help. This is murder. And if someone sent you this footage, it means there's a witness, someone in Hastings' organization who wants him gone. Or someone who wants leverage, Maggie said. That note wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. If I spoke up about Hastings, this goes public, and Brandon sees his father murder his mother. That kid's already traumatized. This would destroy him. David understood. Hastings is using the same leverage on Brandon. The kid knows what his father did. Maybe he saw it. Maybe he figured it out. But Hastings is holding it over him. Do what I say or I'll make sure everyone thinks you're crazy like your mother. Do what I say or I'll hurt more people and you'll be responsible. Classic abuser tactics. So what do we do? Maggie asked. David thought about Rachel, about justice delayed, about the fact that men like Hastings kept winning because good people kept deciding it was safer to look away. We do what we should have done 15 years ago. We build a case so airtight that even Hastings' lawyers can't make it disappear. We find the whistleblower who sent you this footage. We flip Brandon before his father destroys him completely. And we make sure that this time, the truth doesn't get buried. Maggie smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. You know this might get us both killed, right? David thought about Tommy. About teaching his son that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. Yeah, but I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees, and I think you feel the same way, Colonel. Maggie, she corrected. If we're going to war together, you should use my name. David shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip despite the tremor. David, and we're not going to war. We're going to court. It's cleaner, and the paperwork's better. That got a real laugh from her, short but genuine. Ranger, sensing the shift in his person's mood, wagged his tail slightly. Progress, David thought. Now they just had to survive long enough to make it matter. Over the next 3 days, David fell back into patterns he'd promised to forget. Surveillance, background checks, building timelines and connections. His FBI contact came through with equipment and information, enough to confirm that Robert Hastings had been under investigation 4 separate times over the past 20 years. Arms trafficking, fraud, witness tampering, even a suspicious death of a business partner. Every single case had been dropped or resolved with settlements and NDAs. The man was exceptionally good at making problems disappear. But he'd made mistakes. Small ones. The kind that only mattered if someone was looking at the whole picture. David found a former employee of Hastings' defense contracting company, fired 8 years ago, who was willing to talk about irregularities in weapons shipments. He found a city inspector who'd been pressured to approve building permits that shouldn't have passed code. He found a lawyer who'd worked for Hastings and quit after being asked to threaten a witness. None of it was enough on its own, but together it built a pattern, and patterns were evidence. Maggie, meanwhile, reached out to other veterans who'd spoken up about missing services or misappropriated funds. 3 of them had similar stories: harassment, discrediting campaigns. One had been arrested on false charges that were later dropped. Another had lost custody of his kids after anonymous reports to child services. Hastings didn't just bury his enemies, he destroyed them systematically, making them examples so others would stay quiet. But every attack left traces, emails, phone records, surveillance footage. David taught Maggie how to document everything, how to create redundant backups, how to build a case that would survive legal challenges. And then there was Brandon. David had been watching the teenager, carefully and from a distance, using techniques that were probably illegal but definitely necessary. The boy went to school, came home, repeated. But every evening, around 7, he'd receive a phone call. After the call, he'd leave the house and drive to various locations around town. Sometimes it was Memorial Park, where he'd find Maggie. Sometimes it was other veterans' homes. Always, he'd perform his assigned cruelty. And always, he'd return home looking like he wanted to be sick. David decided it was time for a direct approach. He waited until Brandon was alone, walking from his car to his house after school, and intercepted him in the driveway. The boy's hand went immediately to his phone, defensive and afraid. "Stay away from me. I'll call the cops." David held up both hands, non-threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you, Brandon. I'm here to help. I know what your father's making you do. I know you don't want to do it, and I know why you're scared to say no." Brandon's face went pale. "You don't know anything." But his voice shook, and his eyes darted to the house like he expected his father to appear. David took a calculated risk. "I know about your mother. I know she didn't kill herself. I know your father let her die, and he's been holding that over you ever since. I know every time you hurt someone on his orders, you hate yourself a little more. And I know that if this keeps up, you're going to break." The boy's legs seemed to give out. He sat down hard on the driveway, his phone slipping from his hand. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I ended up like her. He said I was weak, like she was weak, and weak people don't survive. He said I had to prove I was strong, that I could do what needed to be done, but I can't. I can't anymore. I see their faces. The vet with the dog, she looks at me like I'm a monster, and she's right. I am. Brandon was crying now, harsh sobs that shook his thin frame. David sat down next to him, not touching, just present. "You're not a monster. You're a kid being abused by someone who should protect you. That's not your fault. But what happens next, that's your choice. You can keep doing what he says and let him destroy you and everyone he targets. Or you can help me stop him. I was FBI. I know how to build cases against people like your father. But I need your testimony. I need evidence. And I need you to be brave enough to tell the truth." "He'll kill me," Brandon whispered. "Or he'll have me locked up. He's got doctors, lawyers, everyone. He'll say I'm crazy, that I made it all up because I'm grieving my mom." David nodded. "Probably. That's why we do this smart. You don't confront him. You don't let him know you're cooperating. You keep playing your role while wearing a wire. We record him giving you orders. We document the threats. We build evidence that even his lawyers can't explain away. And when we have enough, you go into protective custody. The FBI will protect you, and your father will go to prison where he belongs." Brandon looked up, his young face aged by trauma and fear. "Why should I trust you? What if you're working for him? What if this is another test?" It was a fair question. David pulled out his phone, showing Brandon his old FBI credentials, photos of cases he'd worked, commendations from directors. "I quit 7 years ago because my wife was killed. I've been hiding ever since, but your father threatened my son, so now I'm back, and I'm going to make sure he pays for everything he's done. To you, to Colonel Torres, to everyone. But I can't do it alone." For a long moment, Brandon just stared at the phone, at the evidence of David's past life. Then he nodded, a small movement but decisive. "Okay, I'll help. But we have to move fast. He's planning something big. He's been on the phone with his lawyers, talking about eliminating the Torres problem permanently. I don't know what he means, but it's happening soon. Maybe this weekend." David's stomach dropped. "Eliminating? As in killing?" Brandon nodded miserably. "He doesn't say it directly, but I've heard him before. When people become too much trouble, they have accidents, falls, car crashes, overdoses. He makes it look natural, and he has people who help him do it." David stood, pulling Brandon up with him. "Then we're out of time. Here's what we're going to do. Tonight, your father's going to call you with instructions, right? Like always?" Brandon nodded. "Okay, you're going to accept the instructions, but you're going to record the call. Then you're going to meet me at a location. I'll text you. You're going to tell me everything you know about his plans. And then you're going to go home and act normal while I figure out how to keep Colonel Torres alive and put your father in prison. Can you do that?" "I think so," Brandon said, then corrected himself. "Yes, I can do that. But David, my dad, he's not stupid. If he figures out I flipped, he won't hesitate. I'm not safe here. My mom figured that out too late. David clasped the boy's shoulder gently. You won't be here long. I promise. After tonight, you're going somewhere he can't reach. Somewhere safe. You'll have to testify eventually, but until then, you're protected. Trust me. I've done this before. That night, everything moved fast. Brandon recorded his father's call, and it was damning. Robert Hastings spoke in careful language, but the message was clear. Brandon was to go to Memorial Park at 8 p.m. Maggie would be there. She walked Ranger at the same time every evening. Brandon was to provoke an incident, make it look like Ranger attacked him, and security cameras would catch the whole thing. Except Brandon's friends, following in a car, would have a different job. Run Maggie down in the parking lot. Make it look like an accident. A veteran with PTSD, not paying attention. Tragic loss. David listened to the recording with cold fury. This was premeditated murder, planned with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of getting away with it. He called Maggie immediately. Don't go to the park tonight. Hastings is planning to kill you. His son just gave me the details. I need you to stay home, doors locked, and I need you to trust me to handle this. Maggie's response was predictable. Like hell. If he's making his move, then we spring our trap. What do you need? I need you to wear a wire and show up at the park like normal. I need to record Hastings' people attempting murder. But I also need backup. Real backup. FBI, not local cops. Can you trust me to arrange that? There was a pause, then Maggie's voice came back steady. I've been in firefights where I had to trust people with my life. You're asking me to do the same thing here. Yeah, I trust you. Let's end this. David made calls. His old FBI contact, the one who'd been feeding him information, agreed to bring in a team. They'd set up surveillance at the park, ready to intervene if things went wrong. But they needed the attempt on tape, needed Hastings' people to commit fully before arresting them. It was risky. David knew how many ways this could go wrong. But Maggie was a trained soldier who'd survived worse than some hired thugs. And David would be there, armed and ready, just in case. Brandon played his role perfectly. He showed up at the park, found Maggie walking Ranger on the path near the parking lot, and started the provocation. But this time, there was no cruelty in it. His words were loud but hollow, a performance for the cameras that everyone now knew were there. Maggie played along, her responses designed to sound defensive, while actually giving Brandon instructions. Stay clear of the parking lot. When the car comes, drop and roll left. Ranger will be fine. The car appeared right on schedule, a dark sedan with tinted windows, accelerating toward Maggie from the parking lot entrance. But David had positioned himself in the right spot, and at the last second, he stepped into the street with his gun drawn and his FBI credentials held high, shouting for the driver to stop. The car swerved, missing Maggie by feet. FBI agents swarmed from concealment, surrounding the vehicle and dragging out two men who were definitely not teenagers. They were professionals, the kind Hastings hired for jobs like this. And in the chaos, as sirens filled the air and people started shouting, David saw Robert Hastings himself, standing by the black SUV at the far end of the lot. He'd come to watch, to make sure his orders were carried out. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the distance, David saw recognition dawn on Hastings' face. Not recognition of David, the IT consultant. Recognition of David, the FBI agent who'd just destroyed his perfect plan. Hastings turned to run, but there were agents there too, because David had planned for every contingency. They took him down professionally, cuffing him while reading his rights. David walked over, looking down at the man who'd terrorized Maggie, who'd abused his own son, who'd literally gotten away with murder for 20 years. Robert Hastings, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and about 15 other charges we'll be adding once we get you into an interview room. You have the right to remain silent, but I really hope you don't. I'm very interested in hearing how you plan to explain the video of you letting your wife die. Hastings' face went white. That's privileged. That's in my private residence. You can't. David smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Your son gave us permission to access your home security system. He's been very cooperative. See, when you abuse your own kid, turns out they're not super loyal. Who knew? He turned to where Brandon stood with Maggie, the boy looking shell-shocked but also relieved, like a weight had lifted. Brandon Hastings is now under federal protection. You won't be seeing him. Possibly ever. The arrest made national news. Not immediately, it took 3 days for the full scope to leak out, but when it did, the story was everything David had hoped for. Billionaire arrested for murder conspiracy. Evidence of decades of corruption. Witnesses coming forward with stories that had been suppressed for years. The arms trafficking case from 15 years ago was reopened. Maggie's name was cleared, her testimony vindicated. And Brandon, placed with relatives in another state, started the long process of healing from his father's abuse. David testified in closed hearings, his identity protected because Tommy still needed his father alive and functional. The FBI offered him his job back. He declined. Some chapters, once closed, shouldn't be reopened. But he didn't go back to hiding either. Instead, he and Maggie started something new. A non-profit, helping veterans navigate the system, providing legal support for whistleblowers, creating the kind of network that would make it harder for men like Hastings to isolate their victims. It wasn't profiling serial killers, but it was important work, and it let David use his skills without losing himself in darkness. Tommy thrived. He and Ranger became inseparable, the dog's calm presence helping with Tommy's anxiety in ways therapy never quite had. Maggie visited often, sometimes for business, sometimes just because they'd become friends. She didn't shake as much anymore, slept better, laughed more easily. Healing wasn't linear, and the PTSD didn't disappear, but she learned to manage it with support instead of facing it alone. 6 months after Hastings' arrest, David and Tommy returned to Memorial Park on a Saturday afternoon. Same bench, same oak trees, same playground sounds, but different, better. Tommy ran ahead to play, fearless now in ways he hadn't been before. And David sat on the bench, not scanning for threats, not cataloging danger, just watching his son be a kid. Maggie joined him after a few minutes, Ranger settling at her feet. Brandon sent a letter, she said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. He's in therapy, doing okay, considering. Wanted to apologize again for everything. David shook his head. Kid's got nothing to apologize for. He was a victim too. Maggie nodded. I told him that. I also told him that when he's ready, when he's healed enough, he'd be welcome to volunteer at the nonprofit, help other kids in abusive situations, turn his pain into purpose. She paused. Think he'll take me up on it? Maybe, David said. People process trauma different ways. Some want to transform it. Some just want to survive it. Both are valid. He thought about Rachel, about the 7 years he'd spent trying to survive, about how helping Maggie had forced him to transform instead. For what it's worth, I think you giving him that option might be the most important thing anyone's done for him. Besides putting his father in prison, obviously. Maggie laughed. Obviously. She watched Tommy on the swings, Ranger's ears perking up at the sound of children's laughter. You ever regret it? Coming out of retirement? You could have stayed hidden, kept Tommy completely safe. David considered that. I thought I was keeping him safe by hiding, but I was really just teaching him to be afraid, to look away when bad things happened, that the world was too dangerous to care about. Rachel wouldn't have wanted that. She was fierce about standing up for people. I dishonored her memory by forgetting that. Well, Maggie said, I'm glad you remembered. You saved my life. You saved Brandon's life. And you reminded me that fighting back is worth it, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She stood, preparing to leave. Same time next week? Tommy wanted to practice teaching Ranger new tricks. David smiled. Yeah, same time. Same place. But Maggie? No more attacks by rich kids, okay? I'm trying to enjoy a quiet retirement here." She saluted mockingly. "I'll do my best, Agent Warren. But you know as well as I do, trouble finds people like us, whether we look for it or not." She walked away, Ranger at her side, and David knew she was right. He'd never truly be able to turn off his profiling instincts, his need to see patterns, his drive to help people who couldn't help themselves. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the answer wasn't to suppress that part of himself, but to use it wisely, to choose his battles. To remember that doing the right thing sometimes meant risking safety, but that safety without purpose was just another kind of prison. Tommy ran back, breathless and happy. "Dad, I made a new friend. His name's Alex and he's got a dog too, and can we get a dog, please?" "I promise I'll take care of it." David laughed, pulling his son into a hug. "We'll talk about it. Maybe. After you prove you can remember to make your bed for a whole month." Tommy groaned dramatically, but his smile didn't fade. As they walked to the car, hand in hand, David thought about the kick that had started all of this. How one moment of choosing to stand up had unraveled a conspiracy, saved lives, and somehow brought him back to himself. Sometimes standing up for what's right means stepping into something very, very wrong. But sometimes, if you're lucky and brave and stubborn enough, it means stepping into something right. Into purpose, into community, into the person you were always supposed to be, before fear and loss convinced you to hide. David wasn't hiding anymore. And as he buckled Tommy into the car and drove toward home, he found he didn't miss it at all.